Madam President. I want to start by saying a very special thank you to Senator Butler for calling us here today. Today should have been the 51st anniversary of Roe versus Wade. Instead, too many people can't get the medical care they need when they need it, where they need it. Students who are desperate for help get the runaround. Poor women face impossible hurdles. Children who have survived rape and become pregnant are frightened and confused. Fertility clinics are abandoning services, and families that had hoped for a baby face excruciating heartache when a pregnancy goes wrong and doctors are barred from helping. At every turn, we see a new form of hell brought to us by an extremist Supreme Court and a powerful band of Republican lawmakers determined to obliterate reproductive freedom across the country. To every person watching these events unfold and feeling hurt, I see you, I am with you, and I grieve alongside you. But I do more than grieve, more than complain. I fight back. And I am asking you to fight back too, because right now, this is our moment to act. And if we don't, we might not get another opportunity for a long, long time. Roe wasn't overturned by some accident. We're here because Republican extremists have been waging a decades-long war to take down Roe. They poured billions of dark money into our politics to chip away at our rights. They handpicked judges with proven anti-abortion records. They took over state and local governments. They built an anti-Roe coalition right here in Congress. And the very second that the Supreme Court gave them the green light, they jumped into action, enacting the most severe restrictions possible on abortion access. The result? Over the last year and a half, over 20 states have banned or severely restricted abortion access, passed laws criminalizing doctors who perform abortions, or threatened access to pregnancy care, miscarriage care, fertility assistance, and more. Well-organized and well-funded extremists have brought lawsuits to further restrict access, hoping to undermine access in states that are firmly pro-choice. The result has been cruel and frightening. Some people have given in to despair, but I don't see it that way. To me, the end of Roe marked a new era in the movement for abortion rights. Yes, an era that has been harrowing for people across the country, but also one that marks the end of a plan Republicans hatched 40 years ago to reverse Roe and the beginning of a new chapter. And in this new chapter, we're leading the way. Together, we've made clear that an overwhelming majority of Americans support reproductive freedom and individual rights to make decisions about their own bodies. Across this country, millions of Americans have come together and said they are with us, not just in places like California and New York, but in Kansas, Kentucky, Michigan, and Ohio. The Biden-Harris administration has stepped up to vigorously protect reproductive freedom, from defending medication abortion from baseless lawsuits to preserving access to care for service members and veterans, to strengthening protection for patients' sensitive health information. Republicans know that the majority of Americans oppose overturning Roe, but they aren't letting up. Instead, overturning Roe is not enough for them. They want more. They have introduced legislation to ban abortion nationwide. And if they can't pass it through Congress, they'll use a Republican president to dust off a 19th century anti-obscenity law instead to try to get the job done. We cannot let that happen. We have the energy, we have the numbers, and we know what we need to do. President Biden has called on Congress to act. We need to pass the Women's Health Protection Act to protect our human rights and to roll back the extreme abortion bills that radical right-wing legislatures have enacted across this country. And we need to get in the fight right now to secure the Congress that we need to get this job done. This won't be easy, but important fights never are. I know our strength. I've seen it in the millions of people marching in the streets for abortion rights. I've seen it in the thousands of calls made to congressional offices. I've seen it in the resolve of people standing up for Kate Cox in Texas and Brittany Watts in Ohio. And that's how I know that even when it gets hard, we will persist. From this moment on, what happens is up to us. Together, we have the power to restore Roe and to protect our right to make our own decisions about our own bodies and our own futures. I am in this fight all the way. The stakes are too high not to be. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, just now, my friend and colleague, Senator Tammy Duckworth, a longtime champion for IVF and a longtime champion for families, put forward an important bill that would ensure that families have access to the services they need to have a baby, including IVF. Since then, Republicans have blocked this bill to protect IVF. Now remember that, for all of their talk about supporting IVF, when it came down to it, right here in this chamber, Republicans blocked IVF protection. Republican opposition to IVF is terrifying. It makes me furious, but it should not surprise anyone. Donald Trump set the stage for the attacks on reproductive rights when he stacked the Supreme Court with ultra-conservative justices and overturned Roe versus Wade. And since then, Republicans banned or severely restricted abortion in 24 states. They're trying to ban medication abortion nationwide. And now in Alabama, these extremists have virtually outlawed IVF, fertility care that gives people a chance to start a family. This has always been about conservative politicians controlling women's bodies. This has been Donald Trump and the Republicans' plan all along. And the opposition to Senator Duckworth's proposal today shows that Republicans are doubling down against reproductive freedom. They are coming for medication abortion. They are coming for birth control, and they are even coming for prenatal care. Make no mistake, we will fight them every step of the way. I want to talk for just a minute about the people who are affected by these extremist policies. Families in Alabama who have been wanting and praying that IVF can help them have a baby. Women who have injected themselves with medication for weeks or months or even years. People who have spent an entire life savings trying to start a family, only now to see their hopes go down the drain. LGBTQ families who have spent years taking on every obstacle just for the chance to have a baby of their own. And for some, this was the last chance. And now, Republicans like Donald Trump and those in this chamber might try to backtrack, might try to say that they are working to protect IVF. But it's all talk. Senate Republicans' actions today speak louder than any empty promises they make. Americans can tell when Republican politicians try to talk out of both sides of their mouths. The American people want reproductive freedom. The American people support parents and those desperately trying to become parents. So here's what comes next. Democrats have made clear that we stand with President Biden, with Vice President Harris, and with the millions of families affected by these heartless policies. We stand to protect reproductive rights for people all across this country. And together, we will fight for every person to have access to a safe abortion. We will fight for every family to have access to the services needed to have a baby. And we won't stop fighting until we secure the Congress that we need to protect reproductive freedom for everyone in this country. I am proud to be a co-sponsor of Senator Duckworth's bill, and together, we're going to get this done. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I rise today in pursuit of peace in the Middle East. After nearly 5 months of war in Gaza, the human suffering must end. Just today, Americans woke up to the news that Israeli troops had opened fire on Palestinians desperate for humanitarian aid, killing dozens and adding to the more than 30,000 people in Gaza who have been killed during this conflict. Hamas's October 7th terrorist attack on Israel took more than 1,000 lives. Israel, like every nation, has the right to defend itself and the right to prevent another terrorist attack like this one from ever occurring again. Other rights are important as well. The people who live in the Middle East deserve a lasting peace and deserve to live their lives with dignity and self-determination. For decades, the United States government has supported a two-state solution to guarantee those rights for both Israelis and Palestinians. 2 states for 2 people. For years, I have spoken out against the diminishing prospects for a 2-state solution. For years, Palestinians have been poorly served by their leaders, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. For years, even before October 7th, Hamas's governance of Gaza was a major impediment to peace. And also for years, I have believed that Israel's long-term strategic interests were endangered by Prime Minister Netanyahu's leadership. Since October 7th, it has only gotten worse. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his right-wing war cabinet have created a massive humanitarian disaster, pushing the region even further away from a 2-state solution. Indiscriminate bombings in Gaza have killed tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians, wiping out entire families and leaving thousands of children orphaned. Nearly 2 million people have been displaced. 45% of the residential buildings in Gaza have been destroyed. The Israeli government's refusal to allow adequate humanitarian aid into Gaza has left hundreds of thousands of people on the brink of starvation. And still, more than 100 hostages are held by Hamas. The Israeli government's top priority should have been to bring those hostages home. But instead, Prime Minister Netanyahu focused on revenge. He publicly invokes the plight of hostages to justify indiscriminate bombing that thwarts the negotiations that would bring them home. This betrayal of the families whose loved ones are still held hostage by Hamas. Netanyahu's opposition to a 2-state solution is fierce and long-standing. For decades, he has undercut Palestinian independence. He has deliberately propped up Hamas to try to keep the Palestinian people divided. He approved Qatar's payments to Hamas, payments that may have been used for Hamas's military operations. He expanded settlements in the West Bank, turning the region into a patchwork of disconnected parts that undermine Palestinian hopes for a united homeland. The result has been a vicious cycle of violence. That is why for years I have advocated that U.S. military aid should help Israel and Palestine move toward peace, not subsidize policies that move peace further out of reach. Today, Netanyahu is doubling down on his opposition to peace. The Prime Minister has openly and directly rejected U.S. policy. He has promised he will not compromise, and he will hold fast to his rejection of a Palestinian state. Under his leadership, the Knesset has backed him to the hilt. The Prime Minister has also tried to pressure Egypt and other countries in the region to accept Gazan war refugees, raising the specter that his government is working toward permanently expelling Palestinians from their homes. He has insisted that Israel, and Israel alone, must control the entire area of the Jordan River, leaving no room for a Palestinian state. And the fallout from his bombing campaigns is not limited to Gaza. He has given cover for Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other terrorist groups to expand the conflict. The bottom line is clear. Netanyahu's leadership in this war has been a moral and strategic failure that is in direct opposition to American policy and American values. Netanyahu cannot bomb his way to the return of the hostages. Netanyahu cannot bomb his way to security in the region. Netanyahu cannot bomb his way to peace. The only path to protect Israel's long-term security and to ensure that Palestinians have equal rights, equal freedom, and the self-determination they deserve is a two-state solution. 2 states for 2 peoples. This has been the stated policy of the United States government dating back decades. And if this far-right Israeli government does not share that goal, then it is our responsibility to make clear that the Netanyahu government does not get a blank check from United States aid. That is why I have been fighting to condition aid to Israel and protect civilians in Gaza. Over the last few months, I have called for Israel to prevent harm to civilians and for accountability when U.S. weapons are used to target refugee camps and safe zones. I have challenged the administration's decision to bypass Congress in approving arms transfers to Israel. I have worked with my colleagues, led by Senator Van Hollen, on an amendment to condition aid to Israel. Earlier this month, President Biden delivered a critical step, issuing a national security memorandum that makes clear that any country that receives aid from the United States must follow international law, including Israel. This is a good policy, but enforcement is crucial. Oversight of its implementation is necessary to ensure that it is a meaningful step and not just lip service. Netanyahu has made clear he plans to launch a military offensive in Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians with nowhere safe to go are currently taking refuge. The administration has warned that expanding operations to Rafah would be, quote, a disaster that the U.S. government does not support. Meanwhile, humanitarian aid remains strangled and hunger and disease are sweeping Gaza. Netanyahu is on dangerous ground. Every day that he continues, more innocent civilians in Gaza suffer and are killed, and thousands more Americans say enough and call on our government to end U.S. aid for such actions. President Biden has indicated that we are on the verge of a ceasefire that would free the hostages and would allow desperately needed humanitarian aid in. I hope that's true, and it's a meaningful step toward an enduring peace. But until then, the United States has a responsibility to ensure that our weapons aren't used to target innocent children and families in Gaza. We also have a responsibility to ensure that our support is used to advance long-term peace and stability in the region. We recognize that it takes two parties to negotiate a meaningful peace, and we should also urge the allies of the Palestinians to do the same. All nations should push in the same direction: condition aid, return the hostages, resume the ceasefire, and advance peace through a two-state solution. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. We're about to hold a vote under the Congressional Review Act. The CRA was passed in 1994 to give Congress a 6-month window of 60 legislative days to review an agency rule, and if Congress doesn't like that rule, 60 days to overturn it. However, our vote today is not a vote on a notice and comment rule. In fact, our vote today is on something that doesn't even have the force of law. Our vote today is on a staff accounting bulletin issued by the SEC back in the spring of 2022. Now, the SEC has issued these bulletins, they're called SABs, for nearly 50 years without anyone ever suggesting that they were subject to the CRA. The CRA has a time limit for a reason, so that settled law is settled law, something that everyone can count on. And the CRA is limited to agency rules so that a single member of Congress can't tie up agencies and Congress with expedited procedures under the CRA by raking over the details of every agency action. Today's vote, coming more than 2 years after the SEC wrote the bulletin and applying to a staff bulletin rather than a rule, is far outside the scope of the CRA. We should not be holding this vote, and all by itself, that is a good enough reason to vote no. But let's talk about the substance of this SAB for just a minute. Fairness of our markets depends on transparency. Investors in pension funds and 401ks and workers who are trying to save for retirement all have a right to know what they are investing in. Securities and Exchange Commission is the guardian of those financial disclosures that give investors information about a company's business plan, about its leadership, and about the risks that it faces in the market. So to help public companies disclose information about their business in a consistent way from one business to another so that investors can make comparisons, the SEC issues staff accounting bulletins, these SABs, to clarify guidance about emerging issues in the accounting industry, how to tell people about this business. SAB number 121 was published to provide accounting guidance to companies that hold customers' digital assets. It says that because of some of the unique technological and legal risks associated with digital assets, public companies that safeguard crypto assets for their customers should make the risks associated with holding those assets visible to investors. One way that this risk shows up is that if a company safeguards property for someone, just an ordinary company is holding property for someone like stocks or bonds or jewelry, the company bears the risk that the property could be stolen. And that is why companies that hold property for others carry insurance, and it's why they have really big safes. But if the company safeguards crypto, there is a special risk that's not there with other kinds of property. Crypto can get hacked. In fact, there have been some pretty major crypto hacks in which assets just vanish. The risk isn't theoretical, it is real. FTX, $600 million, poof. Binance, $586 million, poof. Ronin Network, $625 million, poof. And Poly Network, $611 million, poof. All in just the last 3 years. We have seen multiple hacks of crypto platforms. The unique risks of crypto can create liabilities that seriously impact a company's financial condition. SAB 121 simply clarifies how companies should account for those risks in their financial disclosures. That's all it's doing. Now, there's a second kind of problem with crypto, and that is if a company safeguards property for someone, stocks, bonds, jewelry, like we talked about earlier, if the company doing the safeguarding goes bankrupt, the true owner of the stocks or the bonds or the jewelry can get their property back. But if the company that goes bankrupt is holding crypto, the peculiarities of crypto ownership and possession mean that the creditors of the bankrupt company could keep the crypto. The true owner may just be out of luck. Once again, SAB 121 simply clarifies how companies should make clear those risks in their disclosures. So let's talk for just a minute about what SAB 121 doesn't do. It doesn't bring customers' crypto assets onto a crypto platform's balance sheet or make the platform the owner of a customer's digital assets. Instead, SAB 121 requires disclosure of what other substantive laws, including bankruptcy laws, are already doing. This effort to reverse the SEC's accounting guidance would deprive investors of accurate information on the risks of holding crypto assets and corrode public trust in our financial system and our institutions. The vote today is about ensuring that the SEC is able to issue guidance that will help companies of all sizes produce strong, consistent, timely, and meaningful accounting disclosures. It's about protecting critical informational tools that investors and companies have relied on for half a century. And it's about maintaining the integrity of our markets, which relies on a clear, consistent accounting rulebook. Democrats should stand with President Biden against this effort to attack the SEC's authority. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
From Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I rise today to recognize my friend and my former colleague, Rich Cordray. Rich's career demonstrates public service at its very best. Nearly 14 years ago, I picked up the phone and made one of the smartest phone calls I've ever made. It was to Rich Cordray. I asked him to take a chance on me to join me in starting a new federal agency. That was just getting started agency turned out to be the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now, Rich was finishing up his term as Attorney General for the state of Ohio. As AG, he had earned a strong reputation for being the kind of public servant who looks out for the little guy. He was in multiple battles, and he led major lawsuits against both Bank of America and AIG. Protecting consumers seemed to be in his blood, so it was a natural fit for Rich to take charge of the enforcement arm of the CFPB. Establishing the CFPB was a huge task. Critics said the new consumer agency was a pipe dream. Republicans said that it would never get through Congress. Armies of lobbyists poured millions of dollars into opposing it. But none of that fazed Rich at all. He always stayed level, calm, and absolutely determined. He did the work needed to bring that agency to life, because that's just who he is. Rich's courage and determination paid off. On July 18th, 2011, a day I will never forget, I stood beside President Obama in the Rose Garden as he announced Rich Cordray as his nominee to be the first official director of the CFPB. President Obama told me two things about Rich. He said he liked Rich, and he said he thought Rich would be a good leader. I agreed. I just knew that Rich would be terrific, and we were both right. As CFPB director, Rich forced the biggest financial institutions in this country to return billions of dollars to the consumers they cheated. And through his work, he proved that government could work not just for the millionaires and the billionaires, but for ordinary people. One of the ways he did it was by having what I call the perfect balance of nerve and skill. I'll share just one story. Rich has never been shy about taking on the biggest financial institutions in this country. In the early days, he investigated Capital One for misleading customers about their cost of free add-ons to their credit cards. These free services actually cost customers a total of about $140 million. So what did Rich do? He put in the work, fought back the armies of lobbyists and lawyers, and forced Capital One to send the hidden fees back to every single customer they had cheated. And the best part, the customers didn't have to wade through reams of paperwork or stay on hold for hours. Rich set up the system so that the checks came automatically in the mail. He set the standard for what it means to protect consumers. But that's not all. On top of getting hardworking Americans their money back, Rich and his team got Capital One to pay an additional $25 million fine. It takes a special kind of leader to get that done. At every turn, Rich Cordray has been fearless. Thanks to Rich, the CFPB has become the watchdog that so many of us fought for. And his legacy is felt each and every day as the CFPB continues to put money back into the pockets of working people. Since it got off the ground, the CFPB has now returned over $20 billion and helped more than 205 million consumers. I'll say that again, $20 billion returned and 205 million consumers helped. That would not have happened without Rich Cordray. That record of public service is awe-inspiring. Nobody would have blamed Rich if he had said, okay, I'm tired and I'm ready to throw in the towel. But that's not Rich. After his work at the CFPB, he asked, what more can I do? And for the past 3 years, he has led the Office of Federal Student Aid at the Department of Education, a powerfully important and often thankless gig. Since joining the Department of Education, Rich has changed millions of lives for the better. And again, that's not an exaggeration. His North Star was always clear. He worked day in and day out to protect working people who are getting crushed by student loan debt. Rich stood up to the student loan servicers who were cheating Americans. And, like he did with the big banks, he held these guys accountable. For years, servicers failed borrowers over and over and over, but faced no consequences as they raked in hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. Rich reversed the Trump-era guidance that stopped states from protecting their own residents against abusive servicer behavior. He implemented new accountability standards for servicers, and he backed that by hard data on customer service and performance. And when those servicers didn't meet those standards, Rich wasn't afraid to hit them with penalties and push out the bad servicers. Rich was committed to ending the days of lousy service and big profits for the loan servicers. One of the most important ways that Rich changed the lives of Americans all across this country was by overseeing the Biden administration's efforts to cancel student debt. With Rich Cordray's help, President Biden has canceled more student loan debt than any president in the history of this country. Nearly 5 million people have seen their student loans canceled, and the administration has a plan to cancel debt for 30 million Americans in total. Rich Cordray led the way in fixing the broken debt cancellation programs and making them work for hardworking Americans. I'll give you just one example on this. Before President Biden took office, only 7,000 people in total, everywhere in the United States, had gotten relief through the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. 7,000 total. Today, the laws are the same, but with Rich at the helm, nearly 1 million public servants have had their debt wiped out. For working people in this country, for mamas and daddies, for firefighters and nurses, for DMV workers down the street and the teacher at your local elementary school, this debt cancellation has been absolutely life-changing. On a personal note, I am beyond proud of Rich. Rich is one of the most effective and honest public servants I have ever met. He has talent and dedication. But what makes him so special is that Rich has always centered everyday Americans in his work. From serving as a state rep back in Ohio, to becoming their first ever Solicitor General, to taking office at the state's treasury, and then as Attorney General, Rich proved each and every day to the people of Ohio that their government could work for them. And when he came to Washington, he always made sure that people all across America knew that he was working for them. Whenever he traveled, wherever people reached out to him, Rich would listen. He'd sit down with people, hear their stories, hear how they were cheated by a big bank or on a student loan, and then he would set about making things right. Rich, the American people owe you a great debt for your work on their behalf. When our country needed you, you answered the call. You are a true example of public service and one of the most fearless leaders I have ever known. It is an honor to know you and an even higher honor to call you a friend. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.